At the company anniversary party, I saw a strange man pull my wife aside and kiss her. The world around me went silent, as if time had stopped. She didn't flinch, didn't protest, and that was enough for me. I left quietly, leaving behind not only the party, but the life we had. The next day, I ended it all with a few words: "You chose not to defend me, so I choose not to continue." She tried to justify herself. She stuttered incoherent sentences, saying she was confused, that the kiss meant nothing, that it was an unusual situation, an impulsive moment. But her lover disappeared as quickly as he had appeared, leaving only shame and loneliness. And I found something I never imagined still existed: peace. The kind of peace that comes not from the absence of noise, but from the absence of doubt. For the first time in years, I slept without questioning whether she still loved me, without demanding things that didn't depend on me. For the first time, I was whole in my own silence. At first, of course, it hurt. Everything inside me screamed. Because betrayal isn't just the act itself, it's the echo. The echo of what was said and then denied, the echo of the touch that stopped being affectionate and became a lie, the echo of the promises once made looking into each other's eyes and broken in the dark. I remember the night we made plans for the new house, the way she laughed when I told her we wanted 2 children, the calm in her voice when she said, "I'm with you," through thick and thin. All of this pierced me like shattered glass, because when we kissed, she said nothing. Not a word. Not a reaction. And that was the biggest blow, the lack of shock, the lack of recoil. As if she'd already imagined it. As if, deep down, she'd been waiting for that moment. I tried to understand. I tried to dig some logic amidst the chaos. But what I found was a hole. A void that formed exactly where she used to be. And when that void sets in, it consumes everything: your self-esteem, your hope, your ability to believe in people. And yet, even in the eye of the storm, I didn't scream. I didn't cause a scene. I just walked away. Because some pains don't need an audience. And some loves don't deserve dramatic goodbyes, they deserve silence. The silence of the end. The silence of someone who understands there's nothing left to fight for. She came to me days later, her face swollen, her eyes red, her voice cracking. "It was a mistake," she said. "It doesn't mean anything. I love you, it was an impulse, I don't know what came over me." But something about her gave it away. It wasn't that she was lying about loving me, maybe she even did, in her own way, but she was lying about the impulse. This wasn't an accident. It was the consequence of something that had been silently building, maybe for months, maybe for years. A disinterest disguised as routine. A distance that feigned weariness. And in the end, what killed me wasn't the kiss. It was the certainty that she hadn't chosen me when she had the chance. I walked for weeks with the feeling that something inside me had died. Every street seemed empty, every memory a new cut. I found myself reliving scenes from the past and wondering where exactly we lost each other. When did we stop being us and become 2 strangers sleeping side by side? I was angry. A lot. But more than that, I missed her. Not her. But who I was by her side. The man who believed, who dreamed, who made plans. That man seemed to have been buried along with the last exchange of glances before the kiss. And then, in the depths of the pain, came the most unlikely reunion, with myself. I began to rebuild myself little by little, without haste, without shortcuts. I reclaimed everything I once was before I lost myself in a relationship that no longer truly embraced me. I started going out alone, reading more, laughing at simple things. And, without searching, I found someone. A different kind of love. Calm. Mature. Silent. It wasn't about promises, it was about presence. It wasn't about instant passion, it was about consistency. I, who thought I'd been broken forever, discovered I could still be whole, and love, not despite the past, but because of it. She, on the other hand, was drowning in regret. I accidentally discovered that I had tried to find the man who kissed her. That I had searched social media, called mutual friends, tried to rekindle old conversations. He had disappeared. Literally. As if he had been a ghost who had come only to destabilize, destroy, and disappear. And this left her even more empty. As if I had bet everything on a bluff. A mistake that brought nothing but loss. A mistake that cost me true love. A mistake that could not be fixed. What she didn't know, and never knew, until the day it all came to light, was what I had planned for us. A weekend. A surprise trip. Somewhere she always said she wanted to go, but we never had time. I had booked flights, reserved the cabin. He had even printed the tickets with a silly phrase, to remind us that love still lives within us. That same week of the kiss. I had the envelope tucked into my jacket pocket when I saw her kissing someone else. While she gave in to an impulse, I carried hope in my chest. The desire to rekindle. The courage to try again. She never knew about it. And when she did, well, it was too late. Months later, she came back to me. Her eyes were sunken. Her body was light, as if she'd lost what weighed down her soul. She asked me if there was still a chance. She told me she'd learned. That she understood. That she'd do everything differently. But I wasn't the same anymore. And perhaps the cruelest thing of all was that, in that moment, I didn't hate her. I forgave her. Truly. But the love was no longer there. And forgiveness doesn't build a bridge where only ashes remain. She cried. She asked me for one more conversation. One more coffee. One more afternoon. But life had already moved on. The love she destroyed now bloomed in another garden. One where I was looked at calmly. Where silence wasn't discomfort, but comfort. Where there was no need to ask for attention. She was left with the absence she chose. And I moved on with the peace I'd built. But there's something she never knew. Something that, perhaps if she'd discovered it sooner, could have changed everything. Something hidden inside an envelope forgotten in the back of a drawer. A detail that shows how much she was loved, before she destroyed it all with a single kiss. And that's exactly what this story will be about. About what lay behind the silence. About what was lost without her knowing. About a gesture of love that never happened. Because sometimes, what hurts isn't what was done. It is what was interrupted before it was lived. Welcome to the channel. Here, no form of betrayal is romanticized or justified. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they reflect deep emotional realities, because betrayal, in real life, destroys homes, erodes trust and scars forever who was injured. Our purpose is clear, to show, through fiction, how one wrong choice can cost you the love of your life. Get ready. What's coming next? Ice intense, surprising and unforgettable. Make yourself comfortable. The story will begin. His name was Daniel. He was 38 years old, with a calm, observant gaze, the kind that seems to listen even when nothing is being said. He worked as a project manager at a multinational technology company, was well liked by his colleagues and respected by his superiors. But what stood out most about Daniel wasn't his position or the meticulous way he organized his spreadsheets, it was the way he loved. He loved with presence, with constancy, with patience. He was the kind of man who remembers dates, who picks up his wife's favorite coffee when she comes home from work, who notices the tone of her voice and the silence too. He believed that love was something built every day, and perhaps that's why he gave himself so fully when he met Lauren. Lauren was the exact opposite of predictable. She was 36, with a subtle beauty that came more from movement than form. She wasn't the kind of woman who walked into a room and commanded attention, but a minute of conversation was enough for no one to forget her. She had strong opinions, spontaneous laughter, and a unique way of seeing the world, as if everything could be redefined. With a degree in graphic design, she worked at an advertising agency, but it was in the world of art that she truly felt alive. She enjoyed painting on weekends, spoke passionately about analog photography, and maintained an unpretentious blog where she chronicled the things she felt. It was in a small coffee shop, almost hidden between two busy streets, that they met. He was reading a book on modern architecture, she was sketching on a napkin. A request exchanged, a shared laugh, and suddenly, something was born, something simple, but with the scent of the future. The relationship grew slowly. Unhurried, without grandiose promises. They allowed themselves to explore each other's layers. Lauren was captivated by Daniel's calm demeanor, by the way he listened to her even on the most trivial matters, as if everything that came out of his mouth deserved attention. Daniel, in turn, fell in love with her creative chaos, her spontaneity, the way she colored his methodical routine. What began as Sunday get-togethers turned into a daily relationship that blended work, art, impromptu dinners, and lazy Sundays at home. 3 years later, they married. It wasn't an extravagant wedding, but it had everything it needed: close friends, sincere vows, and a clear sky that seemed to bless their beginning. They bought a house on the outskirts of the city, with large windows and walls that still smelled of fresh paint. Lauren took care of the decor, transforming every corner into a reflection of them both. Daniel installed shelves for books, hung paintings she'd painted, and together they built a home where every detail told a part of their story. In the early days, there was a lightness that seemed eternal. Conversations flowed until the early hours, touches were frequent, laughter filled the kitchen as they cooked side by side. It wasn't a cinematic love, but it was a firm, daily love, and for that very reason, so precious. Challenges arose, as in any marriage. Lauren went through a period of writer's block, and work began to take a toll on her, requiring overtime and late nights. Daniel faced pressure at the office, leading projects with suffocating deadlines and teams that didn't always collaborate as they should. Sometimes they found themselves tired, touching less, talking more about what they had to do than about how they felt. But still, there was affection. There were still forehead kisses, midday texts, and sincere concerns. They were together. At least, that's what Daniel believed. Communication began to shift almost imperceptibly. It wasn't fighting. It wasn't overt coldness. It was the silent shift between intimacy and automatic familiarity. Dinners became quicker, glances more brief. Lauren seemed restless, sometimes distant, as if she always had something on her mind that she wasn't saying. Daniel noticed, but chose to respect her time, believing that every relationship goes through phases, and that, with patience, everything would fall into place. Still, there was a diffuse feeling of absence in his chest. As if, despite living under the same roof, they had begun to inhabit different worlds. He tried. He really did. He tried to bring little surprises, planned weekend getaways, suggested moments for two that often clashed with Lauren's schedule. Sometimes she accepted with a gentle smile, sometimes she declined with a plausible excuse. But Daniel held each rejection like a small stone, slowly weighing down his body. And yet, he never stopped trying. Because when you love, you insist, sometimes too much. At work, Lauren began to associate with new colleagues. Creative, intense people with bold ideas and striking personalities. Having always sought inspiration in the world around her, Lauren dove into that environment like someone gasping for air. Daniel watched her excitedly, talking about new campaigns, agency events, endless brainstorms. He smiled with admiration, but couldn't help but feel there was a part of her he no longer had access to. As if a door had closed, a door she kept gently locked. He didn't question. Perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of fear of the answer. He simply remained present, offering support, taking care of the house, the bills, the details she forgot. He was the kind of man who washed the dishes without fuss, who brought her flowers without reason, who covered her with a blanket in the middle of the night without expecting thanks. For Daniel, love meant caring even when the other person seemed unaware. And he cared. With love. With silence. With hope. Meanwhile, Lauren felt increasingly pressured by a discomfort she couldn't name. It was as if something inside her screamed for change. Maybe it was the weight of routine, maybe the constant search for something that would make her feel alive again. Daniel was stable, predictable, qualities she admired, but which also made her feel stagnant. Sometimes her heart raced for reasons she avoided confronting. She kept these impulses to brief thoughts, took a deep breath, and returned to the reality of the marriage many would consider perfect. But the heart, eventually, demands silence. Time marched on with an unsettling calm. Birthdays were celebrated, holidays shared with family, new photos added to the walls of the house. From the outside, everything was normal. Inside, almost invisible cracks were growing, the kind that make no noise, but if left unattended, can compromise the entire structure. Daniel, even tired, didn't give up. He planned something special. He wanted to rekindle what had once been so intense. He researched destinations, revisited old conversations where she'd spoken of places she'd dreamed of visiting. He found a cottage in a small town nestled among the mountains, with a fireplace and silence. She'd talked about it at the beginning of their relationship, remembered it in detail. He saw in that place a chance to rebuild the bridge that, though still standing, was already swaying in the wind. He reserved everything in secret. He imagined the look on her face when she discovered the surprise. He ordered a pretty envelope, handwritten a short, sincere, and meaningful letter. He tucked it in his jacket pocket, waiting for the right moment to deliver it. He didn't know his timing was wrong. That his hope, however sincere, would no longer find a place in her heart. But that night, as he left home for the company party, Daniel still believed. He still looked at Lauren with eyes that saw a future. He still felt proud to be by her side. He still believed that love, if well cared for, could survive anything. And it's at this precise point that the story changes. It's at this point that what seemed stable falls apart in seconds. But, until now, what existed was a genuine will to continue. To recover. To make it work. What would come next, what was about to happen, would change everything forever. The week leading up to the company's anniversary was especially exhausting. Daniel barely had time to breathe between meetings and deadlines that seemed to multiply. He'd come home late, exhausted, but never without checking to see if Lauren had eaten dinner, if the light in her room was on, if she'd left a note scattered around the house. She was more distracted than usual, her eyes fixed on her cell phone and her answers brief during dinner. He avoided interpreting too much, wanting to believe it was just fatigue, maybe even one of those periods when things just don't flow. He had faith that this surprise trip he'd been planning would be the respite they both needed. He kept the envelope in his desk drawer at the office, still sealed, still full of hope. Every time he opened it to get some paper, he looked at the envelope and imagined her smile when she discovered everything. He could already picture the two of them on the cottage's porch, barefoot, a glass of wine in their hands, her eyes shining as before. Lauren, on the other hand, spent her nights immersed in late deliveries for the agency. She always claimed to be overwhelmed, but Daniel began to sense something different about her fatigue. It wasn't physical, it was emotional. As if she were hiding inside her own home. Sometimes she would disappear for hours, saying she needed creative space. When she returned, she had a restlessness in her eyes that couldn't be explained by work. Daniel didn't confront her. He chose to wait. He wasn't a man of scandals, he was a man of faith. And his faith, in that moment, was that love would endure. That everything would go back to the way it was before. The day before the party, Daniel reviewed every detail of the evening. The company had rented an elegant ballroom at a renowned hotel, and all employees were invited, complete with a +1. Lauren was reluctant to accept the invitation, but he insisted. He said it would be good for them both, that it was a chance to break out of their routine, to see each other in a different setting. She relented, wearing a simple, refined, dark blue gown, and Daniel could barely take his eyes off her as they got out of the car. There was something different about her posture, perhaps the way she held her purse, or the way she avoided looking at him too intently. He noticed, but forced himself to ignore it. It was a special night, and he didn't want to ruin it with assumptions. The room was lit with warm lights, music playing in the background, and discreet waiters offered glasses of sparkling wine. Daniel chatted with colleagues, proudly introducing Lauren, making a point of keeping his hand on her waist, making sure he was present. But with each passing hour, she seemed more distant, checking her phone frequently, exchanging quick messages that he pretended not to see. At one point, she excused herself to go to the bathroom. It took her longer than usual. When she returned, she was out of breath, her eyes restless, her hair a little out of place. Daniel didn't comment, just offered her a glass of water. He still wanted to believe everything was okay. Later, as he stepped away briefly to assist a colleague from another department, Daniel saw her across the room. She was standing near the side entrance, and a man he'd never seen before approached her. They exchanged brief words, and then he grabbed her arm. The movement wasn't aggressive, but firm. The kind of gesture that betrays intimacy. Daniel froze. For a second, he considered looking away, pretending it wasn't happening. But something inside him compelled him to remain there. Watching. Attentive. And then it happened. The man pulled her gently close and kissed her. It wasn't a lingering kiss, but it wasn't an awkward peck either. It was the kind of kiss that only happens when something has already happened. Something nurtured, desired, rehearsed. And she didn't pull away. She didn't push, she didn't show surprise, she didn't look around as if she feared being seen. She stayed there. Accepting. Participating. An accomplice. Daniel's world stopped. Not as if in slow motion, but as if he'd been ripped from reality. The sounds of the room disappeared, the laughter, the music, the clinking of glasses, everything became a dull void. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't feel his legs. The hand holding his glass trembled slightly, and he had to set it down on the table next to him to keep from dropping it. For a few seconds, he stood still, trying to understand if he'd really seen what he saw. But when his wife's eyes met his from across the room, there was no longer any doubt. She saw him. And she said nothing. No attempt to hide it, to rush to him, to pretend it was a misunderstanding. She just stood there, expressionless, as if trying to gauge how much he'd seen, and how much could still be overcome. He didn't wait for an explanation. He didn't need to. Her lack of reaction was what hurt the most. Because when someone loves, they react. They get scared. They despair. And she just did nothing. Daniel turned around, walked across the room between tables and smiling people, ignoring colleagues who called out to him, and walked out the door without looking back. In his inside jacket pocket was still the envelope with the surprise trip. A detail that now became almost ironic, cruel. While he planned to rescue his love, she was burying it. Night fell over him like a thick blanket. He walked aimlessly through the city's lit streets, his hands in his pockets and his head pounding. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just felt. And what he felt was devastating. It was as if someone had ripped from him something that had taken years to build. There was anger, yes. But more than that, there was grief. Grief for a relationship he still thought could be saved. For a woman he still believed he knew. And for a story that, right there, before his eyes, had come to an end. Lauren returned home much later. She found the room dark, the bed made, and on the nightstand, a single sentence written on folded paper: "You chose not to defend me. So I choose not to continue." It was the first time in years that she felt the ground disappear from under her feet. She tried to call. She texted. She wanted to explain. But how do you explain the inexplicable? How do you undo a gesture that was seen, experienced, and felt like a knife piercing your heart? The following days were silent. Daniel didn't return home. He stayed in a modest hotel for a week, just long enough to find a new apartment, change his work address, and unpack his belongings. There was no scandal. There was no fight. Just silence. The kind of silence that seals the death certificate of a relationship. Lauren, realizing he wasn't coming back, slowly began to fall apart. She reached out to mutual friends, tried to retell the story from a different perspective, as if she could reverse what had been seen. But no one consoled her. Because everyone knew what she had lost. And worse, they knew she knew it too. And it was in this void, in this gap between the end and what was yet to come, that something began to emerge. Something Daniel didn't yet know. Something she'd left behind, even unintentionally. A clue. A loose end. A forgotten detail that would open a new chapter. The secret that would explain more than he could have imagined. And that would reveal not only the reason for the betrayal, but what had been destroyed even before the kiss happened. The months that followed were a time of reconstruction for Daniel, but also of strangeness. He had firmly closed a chapter of his life, with a silent pain that didn't beg for return, yet certain details still hammered in his memory like pieces that seemed out of place. He hadn't contacted Lauren since leaving home. He'd changed his phone number, deactivated social media, and submitted the divorce to lawyers. He avoided any news related to his old social circle. It was as if he'd erased an entire history so he could keep breathing. But the envelope was still there. For some reason he couldn't understand, he couldn't throw it away. It was a reminder of what he'd been capable of feeling, not for her, but for himself. A symbol of his ability to love completely, even when the other person was no longer there. He kept it in a discreet box, deep in the closet of his new apartment, next to old photographs he hadn't yet had the courage to tear up. It was then, without warning, that Lauren appeared. One Saturday, late afternoon, when Daniel was returning from a walk. He found her sitting on the steps of the building, her eyes downcast, wearing the same coat she wore in one of the last photos of them together. Seeing him, she stood up slowly, as if unsure if he would still be willing to listen. Daniel stood still for a few seconds, considering whether to simply turn away. But there was something in her expression that was different from before. There was no arrogance, no forced insistence. There was something broken. Something that perhaps deserved to be heard, not by her, but by himself. They went upstairs without exchanging a word. He opened the door, pointed to the sofa, poured water, and sat down opposite, silent. She held the glass with both hands, as if trying to maintain control. She took a deep breath before speaking. She said she hadn't looked for him before because she knew he didn't want to see her, but that she needed to tell him the truth. The truth from before the kiss. The truth she had hidden not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of losing what little she still believed she had. Daniel didn't answer. He just nodded, and she began. The story wasn't about passion. It wasn't about misplaced desire. It was about something she'd carried secretly for months, perhaps longer than she cared to admit. That night at the party, the man she'd gotten involved with wasn't just any stranger. He was someone from her past. A name Daniel had never heard. A man Lauren had had a brief relationship with before meeting Daniel, and whom, for years, she swore to herself she was over. But he'd resurfaced, subtly, through social media, then through messages, until they became frequent. Lauren didn't tell him, not because she was planning something, but because she was ashamed of her own weakness. She thought she could ignore it. She thought the feeling, if it still existed, would fade with time. But it didn't. She said there had been no physical encounters before the party. No touching. No kissing. Just texts, memories exchanged, and restrained flirting. Until he showed up at the event, invited by an employee of the partner agency, and everything fell apart. She hadn't planned anything. She hadn't arranged anything. But when she saw him there, so close, it was as if years of repression had collapsed in a single gesture. And then what Daniel saw happened. And what she had been powerless to prevent. Daniel listened to her with his gaze fixed, uninterrupted. But the revelation that would come next wasn't about that man. It wasn't about the kiss. It was about what Lauren found, weeks after the breakup. I was sorting through old boxes, trying to retrieve wedding photos to decide what to keep and what to forget. That's when he saw the envelope. That envelope Daniel had left behind, forgotten among personal documents. He thought it was something irrelevant, maybe a bank receipt or some draft. But when he opened it, he found the travel tickets. The cabin reservation. The handwritten letter. She read every word as if she were listening to Daniel speak to her for the last time. The handwriting was neat, firm, and the message direct, to remind you that love still lives within us. Lauren began to cry there, in front of him, as if she were falling apart inside. She said that discovery destroyed her more than any consequence of the betrayal. Because in that moment, she understood what had killed her. He wasn't pulling away. He wasn't tired. He still believed. He still wanted to start over. And she, by giving in to an empty impulse, erased the last chance to save what they had built. She said she wanted to die when she realized what was inside that envelope. Because it wasn't just a gesture. It was proof. A last attempt from someone she thought was already distant. And she never knew. She never had time to know. Because she destroyed everything before she opened it. Daniel didn't respond immediately. His heart was racing, not because he still loved her, but because of the weight of that moment. The revelation hit him like a punch. Not because he wanted to go back, but because it made him relive, in seconds, all the pain with a new perspective. He thought about how rejected he'd felt. How much he'd blamed himself for not being enough. How much he'd thought she simply didn't love him anymore. And now he knew that, maybe, she did. Maybe. But not enough to protect what they had. Not enough to say no to the past. And that, more than the kiss, was what marked him forever. She calmly got up, walked to the closet, and pulled out the same box where the envelope had been. She took out the letter and read it aloud, slowly, as if confirming that she had indeed read it all. When she finished, she folded the paper, put it back in the box, and said, without changing her tone, that gesture didn't change anything. She said that love, no matter how true, doesn't survive alone. That trust is a crystal thread, and that she cut it without hesitation. That forgiveness would come, one day, but the way back no longer existed. She apologized again, her voice breaking, trying to find some opening in his eyes. But there was only serenity. The serenity of someone who finally understood that she had lost what was most precious not for lack of love, but for excessive carelessness. At that moment, Daniel understood that the end came not only because of what had been done, but because of what never had a chance to happen. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just looked out the window, as if telling himself he was free. And she left without saying goodbye, knowing she would forever carry the weight of having destroyed something that, even though wounded, was still love. Lauren didn't look for him again after that afternoon. She left the apartment with empty eyes, heavy breathing, and an expression Daniel knew he wouldn't soon forget, not because he still harbored any feelings, but because there was something irreversible about that silent goodbye, as if the last word spoken had ended not only their story, but also all chances, even imaginary ones, of a possible new beginning. He didn't close the door immediately. He stood still, staring at the space she'd left, feeling a kind of silence that wasn't sad, but wasn't liberating either. It was, perhaps, the final realization that he had survived something that doesn't heal with time, only accepts. Daniel calmly locked the door, returned to the sofa, and stood there, motionless, staring at the cup of tea she hadn't even touched, feeling the cycle had ended, not with shouts, not with reconciliation, but with the serene coldness of a well-defined end. The following weeks were a kind of emotional purge. He continued working, keeping his routine intact, but a part of him was different. He no longer carried the weight of assumptions. Now he knew. He knew about the lost trip, the wasted love, the choices she had made and the ones he had been forced to make. The memories emerged with less pain, but more clarity. He remembered the details, the way she had tied her hair before bed, the slippers left out of place, the drawings forgotten around the house. But now those details didn't tear him apart. They were just memories of a life that no longer existed, like old photographs of a city he no longer lived in. One day, while organizing his books, Daniel found a letter he'd never delivered. It was a letter he'd written to Lauren in their second year of marriage, when they'd had a discussion about children. She said she wasn't ready, and he, while respectful, felt something had changed between them since then. In the letter, he spoke of fear, of love, of the silent doubts growing between them. But there was one specific line that struck him hard upon rereading it: "I only ask that when you feel we're drifting apart, tell me before it turns into silence." It was ironic. It was precisely the silence that destroyed them. She chose to hide it, he chose not to press. And between their silence, a distance was born that never healed. It was shortly after that he met Sophie. It wasn't a romantic or dramatic encounter, just a common coincidence, the kind that happens when two people share the same cafe at similar times. She was discreet, spoke little, read a lot. For weeks, they exchanged only nods, then brief comments about the weather, books, politics. Until one day, on impulse, he mentioned the music playing in the cafe, and she responded with a lingering smile, as if she'd expected him to finally break the pattern of small talk. From then on, they began talking more frequently. Nothing intense, nothing rushed. Just two adults sharing coffee and fragmented stories. Daniel didn't mention Lauren. Sophie didn't seem interested in learning about his past either, which pleasantly surprised him. She was kind but firm. She had opinions, but she listened. She was unlike anything he'd known before. There was a lightness that came not from a lack of depth, but from an absence of expectations. Sophie didn't ask for promises. Just presence. She didn't talk about the future, only about the present. And that, at that moment in his life, was all he needed. One night, while they were walking through a street fair, she asked him what he thought about forgiveness. Daniel answered honestly. He said he had learned to forgive when he understood that forgiveness wasn't about the other person, but about freeing himself from pain. Sophie looked at him curiously and asked if he had ever truly needed to forgive someone. He hesitated for a moment, then replied yes, but that story belonged to another time. She smiled and didn't press further. And he knew, in that moment, that he was in the presence of someone who understood the value of silence, not the silence that hurts, but the silence that welcomes. Meanwhile, Lauren was going through a completely different process. She tried to get back into her routine, immerse herself in work, distract herself with friends, quick trips, and minor changes to the apartment. But nothing seemed enough. The places were dull, the faces didn't touch her, the conversations felt hollow. The man she'd kissed never got back in touch. Not a message. Not an explanation. She tried to look for him, but it was as if he'd never existed. She realized, over time, that he'd been just a passing fad, a costly distraction. But what weighed most heavily on her wasn't her current loneliness, it was the knowledge of what she'd lost. She knew the kind of man Daniel was. She knew the value he placed on the little things, on stability, on respect. And now, all of that belonged to someone else. And worst of all, she knew that someone else would never do what she did. Lauren saw Daniel again by chance, months later, during a photography exhibition. He was holding hands with Sophie, chuckling softly in front of an abstract work. She saw him before he saw her, and hid behind a pillar like a guilty child. She didn't dare approach him. Not out of shame for what she had done, but out of fear of what she would see in his eyes. And when he finally passed her, their eyes met for a split second. He recognized her, but showed no surprise. He simply nodded slightly, polite, distant, and continued walking with Sophie. There was no hatred. There was no coldness. There was something harsher, indifference. And that indifference burned more than any judgment. That night, Lauren cried until she lost her voice. Not because she still loved him, but because she knew there was nothing there anymore. No trace. No spark. Just a permanent absence. He tried to write, he tried to paint, he tried to transform the pain into art. But it all came out soulless. She had destroyed something she couldn't recreate. And now he carried the weight of regret in every gesture. Meanwhile, Daniel moved on. One day at a time. He didn't forget the past, but he didn't relive it. He had learned that true love doesn't scream, doesn't beg, doesn't hurt. It just is. And when it ends, it doesn't return, not out of lack of forgiveness, but out of respect for what once was. Sophie helped him see beauty in the little things again. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of the future. A year later, sitting in the same coffee shop where they met, Sophie asked him if he believed a single choice could change the entire trajectory of a life. Daniel smiled and replied yes. But that sometimes such a change was necessary. That certain losses teach us more than 1,000 pieces of advice. And that, in the end, love isn't about avoiding mistakes, it's about recognizing that some mistakes don't deserve to be repeated. And there, in that moment, everything made sense. There was nothing left to explain. No more requests to make. No return trips to consider. The past was where it should be. The present, at last, was whole. And the future was already beginning to be written. Daniel woke up early even on weekends. The habit stemmed from ancient times, but now it was something his body did naturally, effortlessly, as if the morning were the only truly silent space where he could still hear his own thoughts without distractions. After the emotional storm he had experienced, the days began to take on a different weight. They were no longer long journeys of silent pain, nor empty pretenses of stability. He had found a balance between the memory of what had been and the acceptance of what would no longer be. His relationship with Sophie grew like something new, but without haste, without idealizations. There was no need to make every gesture grandiose or fill the voids of the past with the rush of the present. She knew, without him needing to explain, that she was learning to live differently, and this silent understanding was what touched him most. There was no longer any guilt in being happy again, but there was an awareness of everything that had been lost so that this happiness could have a chance to exist. On the surface, Daniel's life now seemed peaceful. His work was going smoothly, his ties with old friends had rekindled, he attended some cultural events, read more frequently, and risked writing chronicles that he saved on his computer. But deep down, there was a layer of constant reflection. It wasn't bitterness. It was lucidity. A mature awareness that love can be strong, but even so, sometimes it doesn't survive. That forgiveness is possible, but return isn't always desirable. And that certain breakups, however painful, are necessary for something truer to be born. There was no room for idealizations. Daniel now knew that love, when neglected, becomes a pale version of its former self. And when that love is betrayed, even if it's through impulse, confusion, or an unresolved past, something dies in a way that cannot be revived. This was the truth he carried with serenity. Meanwhile, Lauren was going through a process that mixed guilt, disorientation, and failed attempts to rescue something within herself. She could no longer fully recognize herself. She looked at her own reflection with estrangement, as if the face she saw in the mirror were that of a stranger she herself had become. She had taken up painting again, but the colors she chose now always came in cold, somber tones, as if her emotional palette had been reduced to the absence of warmth. The exhibition where she saw Daniel had been a turning point. Not because he was with someone, or because he had moved on, but because she had the distinct feeling that he didn't hate her. And that gnawed at her insides. Because hate is still a form of connection. But indifference is the silence that announces absolute end. And his gaze that night was exactly that, a complete absence. She had ceased to be a part of his life. Not as an ex, not as a memory, but as someone who simply no longer existed in his present. She tried to reconnect with old mutual friends, but found doors politely closed. No one antagonized her, but everyone avoided her. There were no more invitations, no more messages, no more casual meetings. Lauren had become a figure of discomfort, not out of malice, but because of the uncomfortable memory of what she had done. It was as if everyone knew she had held everything in her hands and chose to let it go. That she had a rare love and treated it as if it were disposable. It was difficult to exist in a world where everyone already knew she was the one who destroyed it, even if no one pointed a finger. Awareness was enough. In a desperate attempt to reconnect with something that would make her feel alive again, she decided to visit the cabin Daniel had reserved, the place he had planned for them, the place she only learned existed when it was too late. She made the reservation as a stranger, using a different name. She wanted to see with her own eyes what he had envisioned for them. She wanted to feel, even if only for a few hours, what could have been. When she arrived, the place was exactly as he had described in the letter. Simple, surrounded by trees, with a porch overlooking the silent horizon. The fireplace still smelled of wood smoke, as if time had stood still there. She sat in the armchair, wrapped in blankets, and cried for hours. She cried not only for Daniel, but for herself. For everything she had lost, for everything that would never be. She cried because she didn't know how to forgive herself. Because, unlike Daniel, she had not yet managed to free herself from her own guilt. Daniel, on the other hand, was beginning to understand that love no longer needed to carry old burdens. Sophie accompanied him calmly, unhurriedly, undemandingly. They shared small habits, simple dinners, lazy Sundays, but there was something in that relationship he had never experienced before, the freedom to be who he was, without the obligation to save the other. With Lauren, he often felt the need to protect her from her own impulses, to be the harbor where she anchored herself while she sought to understand herself. With Sophie, he was just himself. And that, now, was more than enough. One afternoon, sitting on a park bench, watching people walk by with their dogs, Daniel was surprised by a boy of no more than 10 who handed him a drawing. The boy said he was distributing kind-hearted messages, and that the drawing was about moving forward. On the paper, there was an unfinished bridge, with a person on one side and the other yet to be built. Daniel smiled at the simplicity of the gesture and thanked him. But as he observed that childish drawing, he understood something profound. Moving forward wasn't about crossing a finished bridge, it was about having the courage to keep building, even without guarantees. That's what he'd been doing. Every day. One piece at a time. That same week, he received a letter. The envelope had no return address, but he recognized the handwriting. It was Lauren's. He hesitated to open it. He spent days with the sealed envelope on his desk, until one rainy night, with the sound muffled outside, he decided to read it. The letter asked for nothing. There were no pleas. Only truths. She said she expected no forgiveness, no return, but needed to say she understood. That she understood what she had destroyed, and how long it took her to realize it. That there was no more room for trying, but that, even so, she wanted to leave a record that, somewhere in her life, he would always be a beacon, not for what they had been, but for what he taught her to be. The letter ended with a simple sentence: "I hope you are happy, and that someone is seeing what I couldn't." Daniel folded the paper, put it in a box with other old mementos, and didn't cry. He didn't feel anger, nor longing. Only gratitude. Because the greatest proof that he had overcome everything was precisely that he no longer wished for time to go back. He no longer wished for anything from Lauren. No explanations, no presents. Only peace. The peace of those who understand that some stories end so others can begin. The peace of those who no longer carry the burden of proving anything to anyone. And the peace of those who, even though hurt, chose to continue loving, not the one who betrayed them, but themselves, as they had never done before. Spring arrived quietly, without much announcement, its flowering trees taking over the sidewalks, slowly replacing the gray of past seasons with a discreet glow. Daniel walked with Sophie through the tree-lined streets after a light dinner, sharing conversations that alternated between banalities and profound thoughts. It was curious how, with her, even silence had texture. It wasn't the kind of silence that weighs heavily, that betrays absence or disconnection. It was comfortable, like a blanket draped over the shoulders on colder days. Sophie spoke little about the past, and Daniel never felt the need to explain his. But that night, sitting on a wooden bench, surrounded by the warm breeze that heralded the end of the day, she looked at him differently, a long, steady look, as if asking wordlessly for permission to delve deeper. Then she asked if he felt completely free. Daniel took a few seconds before answering. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because he knew the question wasn't about practical freedom, but about the kind of freedom one feels inside. He said yes, but not completely, that there were still pieces of his previous history that surfaced from time to time, like distant echoes, not like open wounds, but like marks that time hadn't yet completely erased. Sophie nodded silently, without judgment. Then, with the same gentleness with which she'd asked the question, she told him something she'd never said before, that she, too, had loved someone deeply, and that love had crumbled, not by betrayal, but by a misunderstanding. That she, too, had had to learn to rebuild her trust brick by brick. And that perhaps that was what united them so much, not the pain, but the way each learned to respect the other's time. What impressed Daniel most was Sophie's ability to not try to save anyone. She didn't want to fix his past, didn't want to compete with memories, or erase traces. She simply walked alongside. Listening. Present. Lightly. And it was in this calm that he began to realize there was room for something new to be born, not on the rubble, but on clean ground, free from the expectation of being the same as he had been. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to prove himself trustworthy, nor did he feel the need to protect himself from the fear of being betrayed again. With Sophie, everything unfolded naturally. A week later, while sorting old books into a box he hadn't touched since the move, Daniel found an old, hardcover notebook with some personal notes. There were scribbles of ideas, reflections, unfinished texts. But among the pages, he found a text he had started writing shortly before his wedding to Lauren. It was a letter he never delivered. In it, he spoke of his hopes for the future, of the admiration he felt for her back then, of the fear he carried of becoming invisible within the routine. He read those words as if reading something from another life. There was no longer pain, but a quiet melancholy, like someone visiting a place that no longer exists. So, without much thought, he put the notebook in a bag and left. He needed to close that chapter definitively. She stopped in front of the building where Lauren lived, after many months of avoiding that part of town. The doorbell was answered with a surprised voice, but she let him in without hesitation. When she opened the door, she stood there for a few seconds, unsure of what to say. He held out the bag containing the notebook and said simply that he thought it should be with her. Lauren took it carefully, unable to hide the tremor in her hands. She didn't invite him in, and he didn't ask either. The exchange was brief, but something in her expression indicated the gesture meant more than it seemed. Before he turned to leave, she called his name. She asked for just a minute. Daniel, hesitant, remained where she was. Lauren took a deep breath, as if trying to organize her words amidst the chaos within her. She said she had started therapy. That she had spent months trying to understand her choices, her impulsiveness, her inability to protect what she loved most. And that, in all those sessions, she had learned that regret isn't about wanting to go back, it's about knowing you can't. She told him she still had bad days, that sometimes she woke up dreaming of them in versions that never existed. She said she'd understood that her biggest mistake wasn't the kiss, nor the betrayal itself, but the daily carelessness, the silent abandonment, the selfishness disguised as freedom. She apologized again, but this time not with the expectation of forgiveness. Just because she needed to say it. Daniel listened without interrupting. And when she finished, he responded with something he hadn't planned, that he truly forgave her, not because he needed to move on, because he had already done that, but because compassion is also a way to free oneself. Lauren held back tears, simply nodded, and he said goodbye with a brief wave, crossing the hall with the certainty that he had finally closed the last chapter of that story. In the days that followed, he felt something new, lightness, without a doubt. There was no longer the weight of what was left unsaid, nor the fear of emotional unfinished business. He felt complete with the new life he was building, and also at peace with the story he had lived. He found Sophie at home that night, preparing an unpretentious dinner, and when she asked how his day had been, he simply replied that he had closed a door that had been ajar for too long. She smiled, offered him a glass of wine, and they changed the subject as if knowing that certain conversations don't need to be said aloud to be understood. Time passed with the tranquility that comes after a storm. Sophie and Daniel traveled, adopted a dog, and began to calmly consider the possibility of building something bigger. There was no urgency, just a mutual desire to grow together. She taught him to look at the simple things with more delicacy, and he, in turn, showed her that love can be serene without being monotonous. There was laughter amidst the routine, support on difficult days, and a kind of presence that isn't demanded, only offered. One random afternoon, while organizing photos from a recent trip, Sophie found a folder labeled Bold. Inside were some pictures of Daniel and Lauren, which he had forgotten to delete. She looked at them, turned to him, and asked casually if he wanted to keep them or delete them. Daniel took the folder, stared at it for a few seconds, and without saying a word, dragged it to the trash. There was no anger, no contempt. Just certainty. And that was what touched Sophie most, seeing that he wasn't running away from the past, he just no longer lived in it. Somewhere in the same city, Lauren continued her paintings. She participated in small events, sold a few pieces, and lived alone. She had learned to live with Daniel's absence not as a wound, but as a permanent absence, the kind that no longer bleeds but also doesn't disappear. Sometimes she would run into people who knew them as a couple, and hearing their names together would feel a brief pang, but she learned to let it go. She knew that of all the losses in life, this was the most profound, not because she lost someone who loved her, but because she lost the chance to learn to love properly. And that kind of loss is like a page torn from a book, even if you keep reading, you always know something is missing. Daniel was now a different man. Not because he had changed, but because he had learned to remain true to himself. And Sophie was more than a new opportunity, she was proof that, even after a fall, it is possible to rise with dignity. Life went on, unhurriedly, with maturity. And as they walked hand in hand through the illuminated streets of that same city where it all began, Daniel knew, with absolute certainty, that he had found the right place to begin again. Because, in the end, the greatest victory was not being loved again, it was loving himself enough to accept no less than he deserved. Time moved with the silent force of someone who doesn't ask permission to pass. And when you look back, you don't exactly grasp the moment everything changed, but you clearly feel that it did. Daniel, now 41, lived with a tranquility that didn't arise from the absence of problems, but from the presence of a truth built through conscious choices. His apartment had become a shared home with Sophie, and the dog they adopted together had become more than companionship, it was a symbol of a life built together, step by step, without urgency, but with intention. Sophie was unlike anything he'd ever experienced, not because she was perfect or because they never disagreed, but because there was something rare between them, the silent care not to hurt. They knew when to approach and when to give space. They didn't make unattainable promises, they didn't make unrealistic demands. They simply chose each other, every day, in the small gesture of being present. One night, after dinner with friends, Sophie mentioned the idea of taking a bigger step. Not as pressure, but as an invitation. She asked if he could imagine getting married again. Daniel was silent for a moment, not because he had doubts, but because he wanted to answer with the same delicacy with which the question had been posed. He said yes now. That, for the first time in a long time, he saw meaning in sharing a future without the weight of the past. Sophie smiled, held his hand firmly, and they said nothing more that night. But in that shared silence, it became clear, life had not only moved on, it had been rebuilt with firmer roots than before. On the other side of the same city, Lauren watched life unfold differently. The small studio she had set up with her savings was still going strong, her paintings gaining some visibility in local exhibitions. She landed an interview on a cultural radio station, received invitations to speak on art and emotional expression, and began to attract an audience that identified with the raw intensity of her work. But even with this artistic achievement, there was a void that no exhibition could fill. The loneliness was constant, not loud, but profound. She had friends, attended events, received compliments, but she would return home to find only the echo of herself. She had learned to live with this echo, but she couldn't ignore what he said every night before bed. Sometimes she would wake from dreams in which she saw Daniel's back turned, walking towards someone whose face she never saw. She tried to call out to him, but her voice wouldn't come. And she always woke with the same feeling, that she had let something slip away that would never return. Lauren didn't really try new relationships. A few sporadic encounters, nothing that blossomed. Every time someone tried to get close, she realized there was no room inside her to receive love lightly. She carried too much guilt, too many memories, too many regrets. It was like a suitcase too heavy to fit into the luggage compartment of a new beginning. Therapy brought her clarity, and with it came real pain, the knowledge that betrayal destroys not only the other person, but also the betrayer. She had hurt someone, yes, but she had torn herself apart in the process, and now, years later, she was still picking up pieces of herself scattered by thoughtless decisions. Late one gray afternoon, Lauren received an invitation to exhibit her work at an international gallery. It would be her first trip abroad for work, and despite the prestige, she felt an emptiness that followed her like a shadow. It was the consecration of something she had built alone, but also the realization that this path had been forged at the expense of a history that could not be revived. She boarded the plane with cold hands and a silent heart, carrying with her more than canvases and paints. She carried the invisible baggage of a love she had failed to protect. Months later, now officially married to Sophie in an intimate ceremony, Daniel received a simple letter at his new address. It was a painting, unsigned. A setting he recognized immediately, the mountain cabin, faithfully depicted in the soft hues of the sunset he and Lauren had never shared. There was no text, no request, no message. Just the image. He held it for a while, taking in every detail, and then carefully placed the painting in a box along with other old memories he no longer cherished, but which he recognized as part of the journey to this point. He felt no anger, no longing. He felt understanding. And that, for him, was the most dignified end possible to that story. That same week, while walking with Sophie and the dog, Daniel stopped for a moment in front of a newsstand and saw his old house in a report on urban renovations. The place had been sold, completely renovated, and was now part of a sustainable housing project. He stared at it for a few seconds, then chuckled to himself. That was it. The past, now a concrete thing that had been transformed. Nothing was the same again, not him, not the spaces, not the pain. Everything had found its place. The ending didn't come as a dramatic twist, nor as a cinematic redemption. It came with the maturity of everyday life, with the lightness of love slowly rebuilding itself, with the awareness that some choices truly cannot be undone. Daniel didn't defeat Lauren, and she didn't lose to him. It wasn't a war. It was simply the reality of two paths that separated, heading in opposite directions due to choices made at the exact moment when everything could have been different. But wasn't. And that's enough. Now, it's your turn. What did you think of this story? Share your thoughts in the comments. Would you have forgiven? Do you think betrayal can be fixed? If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe to the channel now to hear more stories like this, full of emotion, twists and turns, and heartbreaking truths. This story was created to remind us that betrayal isn't just a slip-up, it's a deep cut that affects more than the moment, destroying the foundation of everything once built on trust. It breaks bonds, steals futures, and leaves invisible scars that time may soften but never completely erase. In the name of love, loyalty, and dignity, this channel does not support, encourage, or normalize any form of betrayal. Choose to love responsibly. Because when you lose true love, there's no second chance to recover what was lost. And sometimes, the greatest punishment is living with the absence of that which you didn't know how to value.